Good morning, Oregon Realtors. Thank you for joining us this morning for what we hope to be a very informative, lively discussion regarding the recent changes that the NAR Board of Directors approved last Friday. While I realize that Colin and Lester are always big draws, I'm guessing your attendance today is primarily to hear from Matt Difanis, who we are so fortunate to present today to really explain the why and the how on the recent changes to the Code of Ethics. Real briefly, since we have such a limited time, I'm not going to run through their bios. Matt still is the chair of the Professional Standards Committee at NAR that authored these changes. There is no better resource to explain how we got here and what this really means for you all. We also have Colin Mullane and Lester Friedman, both Oregon Realtors from different parts of the state that are your NAR directors. So it seems at least 2 out of 8 of them, 2 out of 10. It seems appropriate to have them participate in this conversation as well, since they were part of the voting body to move this forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Colin, who can introduce himself briefly, and Lester, and take it from there. And I will assist with questions. We look forward to a respectful, engaging conversation. All right, Colin, take it away.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you everyone who has joined us for today's webinar. It's an extremely important moment in the history of the National Association of Realtors and Realtors everywhere. And as Jenny mentioned, we are beyond fortunate to have Matt Difanis here to help us with these pieces. Matt was hugely involved. He's chair of that committee with almost 100 or more members involved in that committee reaching this decision. What our hope today is to maybe bring you on some of the journey that we as real NAR directors got to go through, not just in the last week of our meetings, but also in the months previous to that, in the lead up to this. This is not an arbitrary decision reached by the National Association of Realtors, nor is it a decision reached by the National Association of Realtors, which is often considered the ivory tower in downtown Chicago, making decisions arbitrarily affecting realtors everywhere. So the body of the National Association of Realtors is comprised of over 800 plus directors. We have 10 of those based on our population here in Oregon. We are all voted by our Oregon Association of Realtors directors. And so Lester and I have the honor of representing Oregon Realtors in that body. And so we are also, as is Matt, functioning realtors. We list and sell property, we run companies, we interact with our agents on a daily basis. We fully understand the challenges that realtors across the country face. So when these types of changes happen, it's important to understand that there is buy-in from the 800 plus member body that absolutely represents realtors everywhere, including differing opinions. And what I'll share with you briefly before we get on to and into the meat and potatoes is that the 2-hour scheduled board of directors meeting ran to 4 hours. With a highly engaged group of realtors having this discussion. It was always respectful. There were differing opinions. And today we hope that we get to have similar conversations and explain the rationale as to how we ended up. We had an overwhelming 75% majority of directors voting in favor of it. Those that didn't vote in favor of it weren't voting against the spirit of the change. They mainly had challenges perhaps with timing and nuanced pieces of it and enforceability. Some wanted it stricter, some wanted it to change. There's no decision made at the National Association of Realtors that gets 100% buy-in. What that tells you is you have an engaged body and differing opinions are heard. There was at one point in the meeting, one of the directors did what they call the question, which immediately shuts off debate. In other words, it stops. The National Association of Realtors president, Vince Malta, kindly asked that director to withdraw that motion to allow for a conversation to continue, which she duly did, and conversation did indeed continue. So it was a very robust conversation. So Lester, you're in Central Oregon. I'm in Southern Oregon. You've been to a few of these big meetings. Obviously, we're normally in person. This time we're doing exactly what we're doing on this webinar, and we're visiting via Zoom. What was your take of the room maybe before you went in, and how did you feel during the meeting?
Well, given some of the feedback in advance, I was a little nervous, but I think it was a wonderful, fully respectful conversation over those 4 hours. Everyone felt heard. And I think even those, as you pointed out, Colin, that may not have voted in favor of it, were not voting against the spirit of it, just perhaps in their own mind something else. I like to look at it this way, that there are 22,000 licensees in Oregon. Of those 22,000, only 16,000 of them are realtors. Realtors, that's who we are. And we hold ourselves to a higher standard. It's in the preamble to the Code of Ethics. It runs through the entire code. And that's really what we're talking about here, is holding ourselves to that higher standard. And in a way that we can not only see, but also enforce if necessary. And I was fully supportive of it before the conversation. I'm even more committed to it now.
Wonderful. And I think, again, we've had the luxury of perspective over these last several weeks and months. And so we're coming at it at knowing most of the answers, but wanting to give that same opportunity to those on the webinar today. And I know there's a lot of questions out there, and we're going to do our best to get to those after we go through this process and maybe helping them understand what we went through. We arrived at this decision last Friday. Like I said, it was a long meeting. It was a particularly long week and month in front of that for our friend Matt. And Matt, we reached out to you earlier this week. It was just going to be Lester and I said, well, if we can get Matt, man, that would just be amazing. And you've been so gracious after, so much energy, so much time, so many questions, and I think a lot of misunderstanding through the process. Can you take us through maybe how did we get here? When did it start? Why did it start? And how did we get to the decision that we made? Oh, you got to unmute.
I'm not usually the guy that does that. Sorry about that. For those of you who don't follow this stuff super closely, your NAR directors have access to an NAR communication platform called the Hub. And so they got to follow along for at least a couple of really robust weeks of discussion on this. And, I ended up being the primary face of all of these motions because I'm the chair of the 100+ member committee that they came out of. One of the things that surprises people, when this landed on the whole board, and then in turn on the broader membership, when you get these news flashes from your NAR and state and local associations with these changes, it's kind of jarring. And so the reflexive reaction to rank and file realtors is, hey, wait a minute. This seems sudden. This seems like it's too much, too far, too fast. The other thing is, most of our realtor members are self-employed. They're independent contractors. They're entrepreneurs. And so they tend to have a libertarian, small L, not political, but a libertarian bent to them. I mean, it kind of is part of our DNA. And that describes me as well. I'm a practitioner and a multi-office broker owner as well. And so once again, you have this reflexive, hey, wait a minute. I thought I woke up in a free country. This seems like it's too much, too far. And what I want to share with you for context is the Professional Standards Committee has been grappling with this issue since the first half of the year. This is not suddenly a knee-jerk reaction to the forces of political correctness. This isn't something that's being done as a reflex to political forces of 2020. Now, they play into it, but we're addressing an issue that goes back ages. Any of you who are watching and listening who've been involved at almost any level of organized real estate at your local, at your state, we sit around conference room tables and committee meetings, wringing our hands year after year after year, lamenting the lack of professionalism in the industry and wondering rhetorically, what can we do to raise the bar, because it never gets better and we can't ever raise the bar in a meaningful, effective way. So the concern is age old. In particular, the issue that we were grappling with is discriminatory hate speech, including discriminatory hate speech that happens outside of the world of real estate. And so while the issue, as I said, is not new, going back over the last dozen years or so, and I want to stress, this is the tip of a much, much larger iceberg. But out of the instances of realtor hate speech, discriminatory hate speech that would get reported and make their way to NAR because a state or local executive contacts NAR for assistance, what do we do? What can we do? There were a couple of those a year on average nationwide for the last dozen years. Again, many more of those instances were happening in the field, but a couple of those a year made their way to NAR. There have been just under 100 in the last 6 months. The lane that those were being addressed in imperfectly was the membership duty lane. So you could work within a vague provision of your bylaws, which, by the way, can be no more prescriptive than what NAR authorizes. So you can't change your bylaws to make them more specific about this. It was an imperfect lane to deal with this. And when it proliferated, that membership duty lane was really not good when it got stress tested with a whole bunch of these issues. So NAR received requests from numerous state and local associations and state and local association leaders asking NAR to do something, asking for NAR's help. And there was no specific ask other than this hate speech is getting out of control. It's damaging the reputation of all of us, because I recognize that it is a very, very small minority that would engage in such abhorrent conduct. But every time it gets reshared on social media or gets picked up in a news headline, every single time it makes news, some of these making news nationally and internationally, the fact that the offender was a realtor is always mentioned, always. So it hurts all of us. And so Vince passed it along to the Professional Standards Committee. There was no order. There was no do something. There was no fix this. This was look at it. Is this an issue that can be addressed within your lane? So we called a special meeting on June 29th. I hosted a panel on race and real estate. I wanted to set the stage on kind of what the status of race and real estate is today, because I have an overwhelmingly white committee, probably 95% or so. And if you look like me, you don't see this stuff happening in your market sandbox. I've not seen this stuff ever happening with my own eyes in front of me. I have fired multiple people from my firm this year for racially insensitive, or in one case, a racist comment on Facebook. But that's firing people isn't a perfect solution to this either, because they can get reaffiliated with no discipline record and no bar to membership. So, and in fact, one of the folks that I fired was reaffiliated the next day. No interruption in his business whatsoever. So we had a no holds barred conversation on race that featured 5 Black colleagues that I had asked if they would participate. It was unscripted. They didn't know what I was going to ask them. I posted a link to an edited down version of that video. And I was watching in a Zoom window, much like the one in front of me right now. I was watching during that meeting as the members of my committee were physically recoiling in shock and horror and disgust as they're realizing in 2020 just how drastically different Black America is to this day from white America. And the committee, to its great credit, because if you look like me, you don't see this stuff playing out in front of you where your senses are telling you it's happening. And then what happens is your senses are telling you, well, it must not be happening. With that shock and horror and the physical reaction I was watching in the Zoom windows, that committee was really, really horrified and galvanized. They were ready to pull whatever levers they could pull to stop that they had just spent 90 minutes listening to from a variety of Black colleagues. And so that started a process of the full committee recommending to the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board, aka INTERPS. That's a much smaller, more specialized, more deep in the weeds professional standards group of specialists. They worked for 5 off-cycle meetings, so 5 different meetings of INTERPS over the course of 3 or 4 months, July to September. So 3 or 4 months, so 5 meetings, crafting the set of recommendations that were passed by the BOD at NAR last week. Then another full committee meeting in October. So again, 100 of our committee members debated it for another 90 minutes, and it passed out of committee 10-1. So I tell you all of that so you know, as this lands on you seemingly out of the clear blue sky as a member, I want you to know the genesis of all of this. And there's no question that the hyper-politicized, racially charged environment that we find ourselves in 2020, mixed with the lighter fluid that is social media, there's no question that has contributed to the proliferation. But I want to underscore the problem is age-old, and this was the time to do something about it. So the next big reaction is, hey, wait a minute, I thought I woke up in a free country. The First Amendment literally does not apply to your trade organization. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech by limiting the government's ability to restrict your free speech. And it doesn't limit it entirely, but there are limits on the government's ability to restrict free speech. We're a voluntary trade organization. We literally advertise to the public with your dues dollars. We're realtors. We hold ourselves to a higher standard. We voluntarily pledge to live by the code. And so if we, which we chose to do as a board of directors, vote to raise that bar, vote to expand the applicability of the Code of Ethics, vote to prohibit hate speech and have stiff sanctions if you violate that rule, that is our prerogative to do. And so arguably this was the most significant, meaningful, enforceable way that we have raised the bar in 46 years. So there's your background on how and why it happened.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. We're starting to get some questions, and a lot of the questions I know we're going to get into, so I'm not going to ask them specifically yet because I want to continue to take this through the motions. Again, the conversation today isn't so much about diversity. This is a very specific topic. Diversity is a part of it because a lot of times that's the genesis of where hate speech is coming from. Help me well, let's go back to a question you just made. And then there are people saying, what were the objections? What were the people against on this issue? And you touched on it earlier, and it was about freedom of speech. And there were some big lessons for a lot of us, certainly myself. I'm very aware of the freedom of speech. But what I didn't understand was the freedom of speech pertains to the government cannot restrict your ability to speak freely. And that's a key nuanced difference between whether a private organization or an association or a business or any entity other than the government can actually create some subsets of that. So what the National Association of Realtors, if I can in a nutshell, is saying you have your freedom of speech. If you choose hate speech to be a component of that, there will be repercussions. That's what we're saying. And I think businesses have made that clear. You look at sporting affiliation organizations, news organizations where people slip of the tongue or otherwise have said things, and not necessarily talking about hate speech, but that just don't fit the boundaries that they put on as a corporation, have been fired from those jobs. Matt, you made a decision in your company to let some people go because of things that they've said. And I think a lot of brokers and owners will make those decisions. And that's a reminder that a lot of these rules kind of existed without being written down. We have a social media policy in our office. And if we saw hate speech, we would have a problem with it. And we would certainly consider disaffiliating with that agent. Thankfully, not an issue for us. We're a smaller company. But that said, that's really what this is getting to. And again, a sense of context. So Matt, you're fortunate in your market. You haven't seen any of it. I'm fortunate in my market. I haven't seen any of it. So a lot of people are like, well, why are we even talking about it? So NARs is where we get this flow of information. This trickles up to NAR because a lot of times if a local association or state association can't solve the piece on its own, it goes up the ladder. NAR keeps records of these complaints, and they were getting approximately 1 to 2 complaints per month related to hate speech. This year, because of all of the tensions that we're experiencing, the pandemic, a tight market, political discourse, all of that, it was a perfect storm. And social media was, as you said, the lighter fluid of all of this. They upticked to 1 to 2 complaints per day. That's a massive increase in hate speech that realtors are participating in. My question, Matt, is, and I think this gets to some of the questions, what is hate speech and how is it different from me disagreeing with you about politics or any other thing that we might talk about? Well, what's hate speech? What does it mean?
So our target was a narrow one, which is discriminatory hate speech. So one of the commenters in the chat box talks about sectarianism. Well, where you come from, if it's not national origin, we're talking about Article 10 protected classes. The only change we made was a new standard of practice under Article 10. And we made the change because what we were expanding to was such a direct outgrowth of our existing Article 10 obligations. So I'll read you the exact words of the new standard of practice 10-5. And let me go back out one more level. So people say, hey, wait a minute, get back in your lane. This is going too far. You're reaching into my personal life. I'm going to read you the mission statement of the National Association of Realtors. Our mission is to empower realtors as they preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Article 10 exists because we have a terrible history with a ton of baggage of standing on the wrong side of history when it comes to fair housing and being a source of housing discrimination. So we have a lot of historical baggage here. And today's mission statement, preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Discriminatory hate speech was creating a barrier in the marketplace. It was creating barriers to groups of people that are protected already under Article 10. The very same people Article 10 exists to remove barriers from in front of, we're having those barriers, those historic barriers, reinforced by hate speech that was discriminatory. So standard of practice 10-5, which is the new one, realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. There's an additional 2 pages of a new appendix that exists just to guide hearing panels in determining where to draw the line. This is going to be inherently somewhat subjective, but subjective with very strong guardrails. But that's not new. Subjectivity is not new. Every time a hearing panel has to determine what is or isn't a misleading ad, what is or isn't a true picture, what is or isn't a pertinent fact, all terms under the code as it existed before any of these changes. So we've got a relatively succinct standard of practice that makes clear we're talking weaponized hate speech that targets one or more protected classes. We're not targeting religious beliefs, political beliefs, personal positions, policy positions. We're not targeting conversations that invoke race, that invoke a protected class, that discuss a protected class. We're talking about weaponized hate speech. And the rationale for that is you can't be a realtor wearing the same realtor badge that all of us are wearing, where we say to the public, we're voluntarily holding ourselves to a higher standard, and be a keyboard bigot at night, spewing hate speech that is clearly discriminatory, and claim with a straight face that that in no way inhibits your ability to live up to both the letter and the spirit of your Article 10 fair housing obligations by day. People see that stuff. It has a chilling effect on the marketplace. It reinforces those same historic barriers. So the biggest concern people have, will I now go to realtor prison because of my Trump bumper sticker? A commenter in the chat box, or because somebody in my family has the Confederate flag hanging in their garage. Again, it is weaponized hate speech that is against a protected class. I'm not going to speak for future hearing panels who are going to always be looking at context, but we have literally hundreds of pages. Part of why we in the professional standards lane believe that we were the best lane to address this issue is because we have hundreds of pages of codified due process. The professional standards procedure and arbitration manual is 273 pages long, supplemented by dozens of additional pages of case studies and other guidance that lives online because it is updated so frequently that it doesn't get printed and bound. Hundreds of pages of due process. For any such complaint to go forward, it has to get past grievance, meaning if the facts as alleged were assumed to be true, would those facts constitute a potential violation? I think there'll be some of these that don't make it past that. Well, no. Somebody disliking my Trump bumper sticker clearly does not meet that qualification. So even if that's all true, it's probably not getting past grievance. But so it has to get past grievance. It then goes to a hearing panel. The parties in the hearing, if you're a respondent, if somebody files a complaint, you get to challenge the members of the hearing panel for cause if you believe there's a bias. So you've got protections there. It goes to a hearing panel. The respondent gets to mount a defense, provide context. No, it wasn't hate speech because here's what was going on. So there's due process protections there. Then a majority of that hearing panel that's specially trained in professional standards matters has to find the respondent in violation by a clear and convincing standard, a high burden of proof. And if for some reason all of that runs off the rails, there's a right to appeal. And appeals hearing panels are typically even more specialized volunteers looking at whether there was a deprivation of due process. So I don't expect you all to be pro standards nerds. In fact, if you're well-balanced individuals, you probably shouldn't be a professional standards nerd. All I really want you to know is there are hundreds and hundreds of pages and an army of very well-trained volunteers. So this is not just going to be some scattershot, a political conversation suddenly turns into my getting an ethics violation under new standard of practice 10-5.
Matt, you bring up some awesome points, and I'm watching the questions come in thick and fast, and they're touching on some of the issues.
I looked at 23 new messages.
Oh, we're trying to watch them all. And at the same time, I think one of the questions, and I think the concerns in the board that day were that I see the slippery slope comment coming into that. And I'm seeing people ask, well, can we get a list of the words that we can't use? And I think that the important distinction between what people are looking at when it comes to discriminatory words under fair housing is it's not quite the same, because like you said, it's subjective. So if I say to you, and just for the purpose of example, Matt, I completely disagree with you, and I think you're an idiot. I'm disagreeing with you. If I say, Matt, I disagree with you, you're an idiot, and your head should be placed on a spike outside the association offices, none of those words on their own are offensive. But that collection and the way that I send them made them hate speech. I just made a violent comment against you that could easily be perceived as hate speech. Now, I'm not saying that complies with the definition exactly, but
and it still wouldn't make it over the bar, because nothing you just said was based on my membership in a protected class. If it was you and all the other white infidels go to hell and let's get the army with the pitchforks out to kill them all. Well, now on the basis of my being white or somebody calling me an infidel from a different religion based on my religion, well, then I would have a cause of action.
And I laugh because these examples seem like they're absurd. The thing of it is, it's not funny at all, because these are exactly the types of things people are saying. Very limited number of people. But I'm hoping that everyone that's watching this understands that that's the level they'd have to go to trigger this kind of a complaint. And the slippery slope comment, if you look at the history of the National Association of Realtors, which we've been around since 1908, the Code of Ethics is around since 1913. The Code of Ethics actually is probably more codified in your state rules, that when real estate agencies and bodies were formed in individual states to regulate the industry, a lot of the rules they took were from the Code of Ethics. We gave them the book and said, here, look what we're already doing. And they adopted it to those standards. So the Code of Ethics actually lives in multiple places. And to your comment, it really is raising the bar. It's taking it one step further. This is not a group of people that are going to say, you know what, that's actually hate speech, and I didn't like how that felt, and all of a sudden I'm going to report that. A lot of realtors think that the Code of Ethics, this always is frustrating to hear, but it just means that I can't say bad things about you. Like, a realtor cannot say bad things about another realtor. Well, they can if it's factually accurate. But there's so much more to it than that, but that's what they think it is. And yet realtors say bad things about other realtors all the time, and that doesn't make it to a Code of Ethics complaint. So you would have to really be traveling. I always call it like, oh, I'll go 56 and a 55. That's not so bad, but you'd have to be going like 95 and a 55 to be getting a ticket for something like this. We're not trying to say next year it'll be 85 and then it'll be 75. This is really saying that there are people doing abhorrent things, yes, on social media, but also in person. There's the video that was posted of the gentleman. That's probably the wrong term for him. Matt, I forget where that mark is. Do you remember where that was, where he saw two African-American males parked in his neighborhood? Scottsdale. The no N-word zone. Thank you. This is a no N-word zone. You can't be here. And the media caught it. They ran with it. And the fact is, he was a realtor. And at that time, there was nothing we could do. It was absolutely disgusting. Now, his company fired him. He was gone. But like Matt says, he could really reaffiliate next day, no harm, no foul, with no records in place of anything that was like that. So this was just an example of the type of thing that's out there. So it's not just social media. It's saying, if you're a realtor, think twice before you say something stupid, and bring these. So Lester, your sense of the slippery slope, and how do you feel that part of the decision process went?
It always has to start somewhere. Change has to start somewhere. In this case, I think the process is pretty clear, how it began, how we got to where we are today. I always try to remember that membership has its privileges, but membership also has its responsibilities. And this is addressing one of those responsibilities that we did not have a mechanism to enforce before. As Matt pointed out, it was a membership issue. It was not a Code of Ethics issue. Now it's strictly in the Code of Ethics lane. We have a mechanism. People need to remember that if someone complains about you in your professional day, you have a right to a hearing. There's a hearings panel, there's a grievance committee, there's mediation, there's all sorts of things built in to the professional standards of the National Association of Realtors, of which we are members. So if someone accuses you of something, there's a mechanism. It's not immediately off with his head, so to speak. Nothing against French people, because they may be a protected class. I don't know. But I think that there is a process. We do have responsibilities, and this helps us as realtors protect our brand, but also to protect the consumers that we are pledged to work with.
Hey, Matt, I have a question. Colin, I hope you don't mind if I interject. What legal scrutiny did NAR put this through before bringing it to the vote, to the board for vote? Because inevitably you can see through the questions that's coming, like that. Sure. The way we're defining hate. How does NAR define hate? If their comments are too broad, they're not. It's much more limited application, which I know you tried to explain, but let's keep at it here, huh?
So we've had many levels of legal review. So on interps, the more specialized in the weeds body, I've got a law school education. Two other members of on the realtor side are attorneys. Our staff executive is an attorney. She reports up to Katie Johnson, who is general counsel for NAR. So most things all along the way through 7 different meetings had 2 or 3 levels of in-committee, in-house legal review, and outside counsel was consulted on certain issues. It's been vetted through many, many, many layers of attorneys. With respect to, I saw a commenter wanting some real-world examples. If you scroll to the very top of the chat box, before we even got started, I posted a couple of video links. There's a YouTube video link that I posted that you can find on my channel. So Matt Difanis, if you look me up on YouTube, you'll see a video from 3 weeks ago that's titled, "Is the Status Quo Really a Problem?" I'm not going to repeat them here, but I give several uncensored examples of hate speech. And the words that I uttered making that video have never crossed my lips before in my life. But I felt that it was important. They hurt to hear, they hurt to speak. And I say that as somebody who's not even in the groups that are the intended targets of the hate speech. So if you're not in one of those groups, you really have to ask yourself, how must this feel if I were in one or more of the groups that those rocket propelled grenade forms of hate speech are aimed straight at.
And just
So we're still, go ahead, Danny.
Oh, sorry, one last comment. And looking at some of the comments, of course, there's going to be a difference of opinion. There's a difference of opinion in everything we do. Lawyers, realtors, everything you do. You go to the grocery store, should you buy Trix or Cheerios? But there is a process. Will some panels get it wrong? Probably, or have an opinion that maybe will be reversed or on appeal. But that's why the panelists went through a detailed explanation of the process, because that's an important component to remember. Because inevitably, there is going to be a lot of difference of opinions in application here. They're going to try to get it right, and the criteria is very limited, but it doesn't mean there's not going to be appeals. Anyway. And
I'll read you just one paragraph from the 2-page appendix that is just on this new standard of practice. While the overall focus of Standard of Practice 10-5 is on what might be loosely termed offensive or discriminatory speech, hearing panels should be clear that the Standard of Practice is narrowly limited to conduct related to the requirement of equal professional service of Article 10. Hearing panels should also be fully aware of the nature and scope of the standards of practice under Article 10 and their relationship to fair housing laws as described in a different appendix. Its standards of practice fully integrate the 5 basic fair housing obligations. I mean, it's narrow. This is not targeted at stuff that's merely offensive or that merely invokes a protected class. I suppose the best example I can give is we have a lot of folks that say, well, wait a minute, does this mean if I am a religious social conservative and my church teaches that same-sex marriage is not biblical, that now all of a sudden I go straight to realtor jail? No. The best example I can give is having that belief, being a member of a church that has that scriptural teaching or philosophy. That's a very different matter than one of the examples of hate speech where a real estate professional under their business page with the word realtor in the name of the business page posts, gays and lesbians are guilty of murder according to the scriptures. The very next post is, check out this fine assortment of listings in my metropolitan area. That is weaponizing hate speech. If you are LGBTQ and you're a consumer and that's in your newsfeed, you can't tell me that isn't creating a barrier on some level to access to housing. And so our commitment under Article 10 is not new. It's been there since 1974. Sexual orientation and gender identity were added in more recent years, but still those are many years old, both over a decade. There's a lot of protections built into this, folks. I don't want you to think that suddenly the Realtor Professional Standards Police are sniffing around your personal life. Others have asked, well, what's the evidence? It's a clear and convincing standard. Probably the most infamous examples, because they get shared so well, the no N-word zone in Scottsdale. Well, that's a video. The video itself of the guy saying it, of course, goes viral. So in the case of social media, of course, a screenshot of the post or somebody downloading the video or doing a screen capture of the video, that ends up submitted into evidence. If somebody says something in an email, but otherwise, if it's somebody used the term hearsay, if somebody just hears somebody say it and they want to make a complaint over it, they've got to introduce evidence, and the evidence is going to be testimony, but they've got to get that hearing panel to believe that what's being alleged, number one, the grievance committee has to have determined that what's being alleged would meet the definition of a violation if it's true. And then the hearing panel has to be persuaded to at least a clear and convincing standard that this occurred and that it was a violation. And there's no one size fits all sanctioning. So it doesn't mean you're immediately kicked out of the organization or fined $15,000. It's a big deal if you're guilty of engaging in discriminatory behavior or discriminatory hate speech, but we debated that, and there is no minimum. There's no one size fits all because the circumstances can be quite different.
And I think, Matt, to your point, and I still see these questions coming in, and the challenge with a format like this and the questions as they come in is they're doing what we call committee work. This is what it's like in a board meeting sometimes, like, hey, you're doing committee work. And that's not to take away from the validity of the questions. They're absolutely right. But the questions that we're seeing reflected, and if you're not hearing answers specifically, we apologize. There's a lot there. But what they're saying is, well, what about this? And what about that? And isn't this? And what if you redefine hate? And how do, if your definition of hate is different than my definition of hate? What we're talking about here is a shift in the standard of practice. So the definition of hate as established today and will be continued forward, your group of peers will continue to work on this. Peers that are made up of the same elements of the board of directors from a broad spectrum of experience, from a broad spectrum of background and understanding, both politically, religiously, all of these things. It's your peers that will be in these rooms helping to work through this. So, Matt, what you're saying is it's highly complex. The bar is actually pretty high in terms of you'd have to go all the way to here. Now, somebody might report you here, and I think that's the concern. Like, I might get reported because I said something that I don't think is hateful. And if, hey, I reported it because the person that reported it might have a sensitivity level that might be lower than mine or higher than mine, and say, I'm going to report you. Where the panel comes in is they become the adjudicator saying that didn't meet the threshold. Colin went off on a rant and he doesn't like shopping in this particular supermarket because it's Saturdays and it's too busy. That's not the same as what we're trying to get to. That's the safety valve. Could you get reported for small stuff that people don't get it right? They don't understand what we're trying to get to? Absolutely. That happens already. If you've ever, at least in Oregon, hasn't happened to me, but I've certainly heard my fair share of complaints of people that have said, hey, I got reported to the agency for something. 90% of those go away because they didn't meet, the consumer or the other realtor didn't fully understand what they were trying to report. And in actual fact, it wasn't a violation. This is something similar, but it's a clear line in the sand that's saying, we see it when it happens and it's bad, and we're going to address it. And we're going to make sure that our members have a clear understanding. And what I'd like to believe is that what we know today will be a lot clearer next year and in years past this, and the standard of practice will be firmly established. So this is a starting point. Is it perfect? We don't know. Will it change? Possibly. We see that all the time. Our Code of Ethics is a living, breathing document. It has been since 1913. This is the latest piece that addresses a current problem. And so I think my hope is that you trust your directors. You continue to talk to us. We need to hear from all of you, which is why we're doing this. It's part of the key process. If there's a need to revisit this for whatever reason, we and people like Matt and his committee will do exactly that. So there's no such thing as perfect in any association, but we have to start somewhere. And the overwhelming majority of NAR directors made that decision last Friday to do it. And again, repeating many of the concerns and the questions that we're seeing here. Matt, where do you see the biggest challenge for the initial panelists that will decide these things?
Well, NAR is already working in all of the pro standards leadership teams. So there's several of us as the committee chair from 2020, and I moved to be the interpretations and procedures advisory board, the more specialized, smaller board. I'm chair of that in 2021, so I won't be escaping this for a while. So there's a couple of things. We're going to be doing a training blitz. NAR is already working on that. That'll be happening way faster than any possible complaint could be getting to hearing. Number two, we have a team on standby. By its definition, we can't foresee unforeseeable outcomes, but we're ready for the unforeseeable outcomes. So let's just say that we find out that hearing panels are kind of going off the rails with this. And, speaking as somebody who's been in the front lines of actually coming up with the recommendation, if we in that pro standards lane realize that is not what this was intended to be doing, we have a ton of resources at our disposal to react very quickly to provide additional guidance in the form of appendices or revised language in existing appendices or published case studies. For this fact pattern scenario, this should not result in a violation being found. So we are on standby so that if any of the sentiments that I'm conveying don't end up borne out in the real world, we will be adjusting and shoring up the guardrails. But as I said, our particular lane starts with hundreds of pages of guardrails. We can't have, just referencing some of the comments in the chat box, we can't have the George Carlin, here are the banned words. It doesn't work that way. Context matters. Some of the banned words, depending on if we were going to have that, some of the banned words, depending on the context, depending on who's uttering them, if they're uttering them within a protected class, not across protected classes, there's just a million different variables here. And so that goes back to some degree of subjectivity, but with strong guardrails. People are concerned that hate speech isn't well defined. Well, hate speech is well defined in a variety of different. So we have, as an example, and I'm reading from our appendix that's now part of the guidance, NAR's Code of Conduct, an anti-harassment policy clearly defines harassment and sexual harassment. And so those definitions are offered. Inappropriate conduct, comment, display, action, or gesture based on, and then there's the protected classes or any protected characteristic. So we can't say, here's exactly what you can or cannot say, because in part, we want to make sure that we're not over restrictive, and we want to make sure that somebody that doesn't deserve a violation has an opportunity to say, no, here was the context, here was the scenario, this was misunderstood or misapplied, this was not hate speech. And if it's oral only, you're having to meet that clear and convincing standard of proof with credible testimony. Hearsay testimony is permitted in pro standards world. It wouldn't typically be permitted in most cases in courts of law, but the hearing panel still gets to judge. I'm not necessarily going to take this person's word for what this other person that's not here said. I want to hear it straight from this other person who was the firsthand witness. So we have all of the usual professional standards protections where the respondent can bring in witnesses that says, no, I'm going to tell you I was the other party in that conversation, and I'm here to tell you about the context. There's just reams of guardrails, procedural guardrails. So again, I need you all, if you're members, I need you all to be out selling real estate and making a living. And you're welcome to look up the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual and thumb through it if you ever find yourself afflicted with insomnia. But as I said earlier, normal, well-balanced, productive individuals in the field shouldn't be in that manual. But it's there if you want to peruse it and see the hundreds of pages of due process that protects you all.
One comment. I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a pitch for you as members to get involved with your professional standards committee. Volunteer, be part of this solution, be part of that hearings panel, the grievance panel, be part of this whole thing and not just an observer.
One comment I'd like to point out is, Matt, this is a really tough thing for members to understand, yet we ask our members to apply procuring cost standards every day. It is very factual. It is very individual case basis to make the determination. This is no different. I mean, there is no one procuring cause case that's the same. So it's all about all of the spokes of a wheel, looking at all of the facts. And this is the same thing. Yet we've been doing it in everything we do, everything you all do in practice with our professional standards panel in almost every article if there's a hearing. And the safeguards are there. And I like how Matt, Colin, and Lester have really emphasized that. And I know we're getting close to the end of time, but one of the questions is about the agency reporting. Can you guys talk about that? Because I know that's a big component for our members to understand.
I'll let Matt continue that, but there's this is a key component to the change, and it would exist here in Oregon for sure. And Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. And I know I see Rick Harris jumping in a few key locations in the questions and answers. Thank you, Rick. Rick is also an NAR director with a lot of experience on this. That if during the process of a panel hearing, it has been determined that the realtor has violated fair housing, that the agency would then forward that as it relates to the real estate transaction specifically, okay? So you're in a real estate transaction, there's an investigation around whatever you did, and it's determined that you committed a fair housing violation, that the agency, or excuse me, that the association would then be required to forward that to the agency for additional investigation by them to their standards. That, Matt, do I have that right?
Yeah, so public trust is a category that refers to bad acts, because normally pro standards is confidential. The charges, the allegations, the process is all confidential. And even in the limited jurisdictions that allow you to publish the violations, that's only internally published. That's not published to the public. And so violations of the public trust, with certain exceptions, if it's a really bad act, if it's a violation of the public trust, it triggers a mandated reporting to applicable government agencies. And so a violation of the public trust until Friday included in its categories willful discrimination. But Article 10 didn't have a willful requirement. So as the code existed before Friday, you could have an Article 10 violation, but you could have the respondent saying, yeah, but it was egregious, but I didn't do it on purpose. Therefore, whatever you do, I'll pay my fine to you, but whatever you do, don't report it to the state. Well, that didn't make any sense. So that's now congruous. However, I said earlier, the government can't restrict your personal speech. And there is a carve out. So while we're expanding the applicability of the code to be able to apply to private hate speech outside a realtor's job, outside their real estate activities, if they're found in violation of Article 10 under Standard of Practice 10-5, and if it is outside the scope of real estate related activities, then that won't get reported to the government. And one of the reasons is there's no point. The government, those are the ones that are restricted by the First Amendment. They can't sanction you generally for purely private hate speech, no matter how racist or anti-Semitic or whatever the protected class is. If it's purely private, that's where the government's limited. And I want to mention one thing Jenny said. She talked about realtors having to judge procuring cause on a regular basis, which reminded me procuring cause in arbitration matters is merely a preponderance threshold. So in other words, if it's more likely than not, here's who you give it to. I go back to ethics. The bar is a much higher, clear and convincing standard. There is a presumption of innocence. The burden is on the complainant to prove it beyond a clear and convincing standard.
Excellent. I'm still seeing some conversations. I mean, there's over 1,000 people on this. There's always going to be somebody that's going to walk away either not satisfied or not believing that this is something that's going to work out. What I would ask is that there's an element of trust in the people in the room making these decisions and the future people in the room making those decisions. This has nothing to do with political speech. I see that question up there. Absolutely not. We have made some really tough decisions as an organization in the past that has worked out well. And like I said, if for some reason it did go off the rails, we would correct that too. We have a history of moving in the right direction. We are here to promote real estate, the success of realtors, and protect the industry and the reputation of realtors everywhere. We do lots of other things. The agency does different things. And you are independent contractors free to practice your business however you want and compete with your competitors. What we're trying to say is that if you're out there in the public and you're going to say hateful things, very hateful things, now, and I don't need to see in the post, like, well, define very hateful. It's out there. We've talked about it. And I think you know it when you see it. It's typically, thankfully, when I say thankfully, I mean it because on a YouTube video or something like that, it's not something you're a part of, okay? I hope that none of you get to experience it, but to see the complaints and to see what they're complaining about, it becomes a lot clearer what hate speech truly is and why it needs to be addressed by our industry and to raise the bar. This is not something that people will arbitrarily want to be in a room hearing about whether you disagreed with someone politically and maybe use some harsh words. It's not intended to catch that at all. I have no business in that room. I don't want to be in that room adjudicating that. Neither does Matt, neither does Lester. Jenny rises to the EO level because they get to see who's got to serve on those panels at some point and make sure it's the right people. It's absolutely not at all what it's supposed to be. So I would definitely encourage people to have faith in the realtors as part of the process, and know that if we don't get it right, we'll make a change. It's not as end of the world stuff as some people seem to think. And we every single time NAR makes a big decision, Inman loves to brand it as an end of the world type thing. It's clickbait. It gets a lot of interaction. It gets a lot of questions without the substance and the context that hopefully we are providing here today.
My
Lester,
vice chair and me, like Thelma and Louise, driving the car right over the cliff.
Yeah.
I just want to mention to people that if you believe in the code of ethics, it should apply to you, not just in your business practice, but in the way you live your life. The golden rule, very simple. It's in the preamble. It leads up to everything. Practice the golden rule. The code of ethics is all about both business and personal. Your life will be better. People around you will be happier. And we have a mechanism how to get bad actors out of the business instead of having them walk across the street and hang their shingle with somebody else. And I know somebody asked about that earlier, and that's one of the benefits, I think, of this change, is we have that mechanism now.
Yeah.
And I appreciate
I will tell you, as a business decision, it's a bad idea to be an a-hole, but being an a-hole is not actionable under the code, either before Friday or since Friday. I'm not suggesting that it's a good idea for you to be that type of a person, but I just want to underscore getting into an argument with somebody, being a jerk, having a political difference. None of that is what this targets. This is targeting a problem that is really toxic and relates directly to our before Friday, our pre-existing obligation to make sure we are making access to real property available to all, and in particular, making sure we do not erect or reinforce historic barriers that protected classes have experienced.
And like anything new, NAR is constantly working on training materials for the panels, ongoing. So yes, the concern like, oh God, how is this going to be applied and how will our members know what to do? It's going to be a work in progress, but it's like any new concept introduced to the industry. So we'll keep working at it. And here at OAR, we'll do OAR, Oregon Realtors now. We will do everything we can to bring you education and work with NAR, Matt and his crew and the legal team at NAR, and we'll be on it. And we'll make sure you're well educated and understand.
I just want
I authorize the sharing of my contact info. It's in the top of the chat box. So if others of you have other questions, let me know. But the one thing I want to leave you with is, as I've been watching the chat box, there's nothing in there that we haven't discussed, that we haven't agonized over in the process of coming out with these recommendations. So I hope that offers at least some reassurance. We don't take this lightly, and this wasn't half-baked. This was agonized over months and many hours of meetings.
And thanks for your service and leadership on that, Matt. Truly valuable.
Yeah, you did an extraordinary job last week on multiple committees. I think you slept for the whole weekend to recover because you were running and then come back and do this. Well, that's the thing.
Somebody sent me a screenshot of their stopwatch. My committee report, one sub item on the agenda, 1 hour, 48 minutes. It's a record. While I was standing here on a hot mic and a live camera. Guys, I appreciate the chance to hang out with all of you. You know where to find me. I have my contact info there. Let me know if there's anything, or if you come up with something new that I can assist with. And keep your ear to the ground, because as I said, if this doesn't go the way I have represented it, we have mechanisms to make course corrections quickly. So this is not the end of the conversation. This is the end of one chapter of it. Keep the dialogue open, and I appreciate all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. On behalf of the Oregon Realtors, thank you. Colin and Lester, on behalf of the Oregon Realtors, thank you for serving as NAR directors on behalf of Oregon, along with your 8 colleagues who aren't on today. But thank you very much for all the work you all do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Erica, anything we need to conclude with?
No, we are good. I wanted to share this was recorded. It's live on YouTube already. If you want to watch it without CE, you're more than welcome to share it out. I will be sharing the link for CE in the next 2 weeks, and that'll be $15 to watch for CE. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be sending a follow-up email.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.